Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. FODI started in 2009 and is the original disruptive ideas festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. We may not want to admit it, but as the award-winning columnist and psychologist Jesse Bering reveals in Perv, there is a spectrum of perversion along which we all sit. Whether it's voyeurism, exhibitionism, or your run-of-the-mill foot fetish, we all possess a suite of sexual tastes as unique as our fingerprints, and as secret as the rest of the skeletons we've hidden in our closets. In his 2012 talk, Bering humanises so-called deviants, while at the same time asking serious questions about the differences between thought and action. He presents us with a challenge: to understand that our best hope of solving some of the most troubling problems of our age hinges entirely on the amoral study of sex. Please enjoy Jesse Bering in We Are All Sexual Perverts.
I'm very pleased to be here. This is a really interesting opportunity for me to explore these particular questions about sexual deviance and perversion. And I would imagine that most people here are perverts. And in fact, that's the argument that I'm going to try to make and try to convince you of at some point during the talk. And also addressing some of the deeper sort of moral and philosophical questions about what it means to be a pervert and to be classified as a sexual deviant. So with that in mind, let me try to lay out for you sort of what I mean when I say that you are a sexual deviant. And I do think you are probably a pervert through and through if we look closely enough. And I don't want you to get too defensive here. Imagine, for example, if some infinitely obtrusive and omniscient bureaucratic arm of the government existed solely to document every sexual response of every citizen, from the most tempestuous orgasmic excesses to the slightest twinges of genitalia, to unseen hormonal cascades and subcranial machinations. Filed under your name in particular in this fictional scientific universe, would be your very own scandalous dossier. Intricate and exhaustive in its every embarrassing measurement of your self-lubricating loins. And remember, this goes all the way back to your earliest adolescence. And buried somewhere in this secret biography, I would imagine, is a cold, hard, undeniable fact of your erotic response that would probably hobble you instantaneously with shame should anyone ever find out. Now, perhaps it was just a fleeting, long-forgotten secretion, a lingering gaze misplaced, a furtive whiff of some object redolent with another person, a wayward click of the mouse, hypothalamic effervescence that made you tingle down below. But nevertheless, this is also a corporeal reality that is specific to you as an individual. It's a shocking, incontrovertible deed of your body, or an outright commission of lust that you've probably never shared with a single soul. You've probably never even dared whisper it to yourself, in fact. Now, if taken in isolation, perhaps even in context, this unblinking fact, this unique venereal data point, would probably register in the consciousness of someone somewhere else in this very audience today as evidence of your sexual deviance, or even potentially your criminality. So in the unforgiving layer of another's critical eyes, I would say you are, and many other people here would say, you are a filthy, loathsome pervert because of it. In other words, you're human just like the rest of us. And that's true for anybody. I mean, for blue-haired grandmothers, of somnambulant school teachers, of faultless nuns, and of us, of you. Under all skins once roamed a concupiscent beast. But the best-kept secret is bigger than the universality of these sordid turn-ons. Rather, it's this. And this is why I'm interested in this topic as a psychologist. Exploring these perversions is moral progress. The illumination of any corner of the vast psychological cosmos that makes us human, even the very darkest corners, is a moral accomplishment by virtue of its ability to outshine our ignorance, our fear, and our denial of reality. For those who are willing to tether themselves mercilessly to these twin pillars of science and rationalism, it's well worth getting one's thoughts a little dirty, even a lot dirty perhaps, while excavating our species' lascivious soul. The rats therein will flee at the daylight falling at their feet. There's only so far that our sympathies can take us, of course, and entering other minds is neither pleasant, it's not pretty, when it comes to certain categories of sex offenders. But even the worst of them are human. And so, in effect, they are we. That is to say, they are our species and not some other animal. I consider nothing that is human alien to me. This is what the Roman philosopher Terence once said. Terence, of course, didn't know of the hundreds of paraphilias and fetishes that researchers would come to discover, including, let's see here. We'll get to those in just a second. Oh. These are just the A's in terms of the paraphilias. Which are quite interesting. You can ask me about any of those in particular if you'd like later on. So he didn't know anything in particular about these paraphilias. We would eventually come to discover them. But he voiced that argument at least a century before Christ was even born. So I think it's possible that Terence would have trouble finding common psychological ground with, say, teratophiles. Here's a picture of the elephant man, Joseph Merrick. Teratophiles are those who are attracted to the congenitally deformed. This is their primary erotic target. Or autoplushophiles, we just saw a picture of that earlier. These are individuals who masturbate to their own image as anthropomorphized stuffed animals. You probably heard about furries before, and I should point out that not all furries actually have this sexual orientation, but there is a small percentage of furries that actually are attracted to themselves erotically as the image of a stuffed animal. So when we have such knowledge, however, we can, I think, at this point try our best to really sort of fulfill Terence's legacy today, really try to understand what makes them human and what we have in common with them. Now, before we go much further, I think a brief etymology lesson is probably in order here. Perverts weren't always the libidinous boogeymen that we know and loathe them as today. And I don't simply mean this to imply the obvious fact that sexual mores have shifted dramatically over the course of history and across societies. That's certainly true, of course. Rather, throughout our past, the very word pervert literally meant something else entirely than what it does today. Although it probably wouldn't have helped his case, for example, the peculiar discovery that some peasant during the reign of, say, Charles II used conch shells for anal gratification, or that he inhaled deeply a stolen batch of ladies' corsets, would have been merely coincidental to any accusations of his being perverted. In 1646, the British lexicographer Thomas Blount included the following brief entry for the verb pervert in this book, Glossographia, which was a book also known by its more cumbersome title, A Dictionary Interpreting the Hard Words of Whatsoever Language Now Used in Our Refined English Tongue. And here was his definition: to turn upside down, to debauch or seduce. Now, it's true that all of these activities do occur with some regularity in your typical suburban bedroom. But in fact, we only perceive these lewd winks in Blount's definition of a term that was floating around the Old English countryside through the warped lenses of our own modern minds. The word seems to fit so perfectly, I think, with the subject of sexual deviance today. The very ring of it, pervert, is at once melodious and cloying. It's producing a noticeable snarl on the speaker's face. Pervert. It's so rich. So the image of a lecherous child molester or a trench-coated flasher in a park, a pornographer, or a serial rapist is conjured up in our heads. Yet despite this impression of some deeper semantic reality, the real lexical heart of a pervert was something altogether different from most of its existence. For hundreds of years, your average pervert was simply an apostate who had willfully turned his back on the draconian morality of the medieval church. Its first written appearance was in the pages of the Catholic mystic Boethius's treatise Consolation of Philosophy, which was composed in Latin around the year 524 AD. And it was translated into Old English by Chaucer only in the 14th century. So Boethius's perverter, from which Blount's definition certainly originates, was a bland turning away from what is right. And that meant much the same as it does for God-fearing people today, which is to say somehow against what is biblical. If we borrow this definition for the present iconoclastic world of science, and perhaps the best example of a pervert might be somebody like this, the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. In this context, Dawkins, who is, of course, the author of The God Delusion and a well-known atheistic proselytizer, many would say, has long been wantonly seducing individuals to turn away from canonical teachings. He was a pervert in the truest sense of the term. And, of course, there are others as well. You might recognize some of these faces here. These would all be perverts in the classical sense of the word, without anything to do with sexuality. Well, perhaps sexual, too, but that's a different question. So it was only at the tail end of the 19th century that the label pervert leapt from the histrionic sermons of fiery Christian preachers and into the heady, clinical discourses of stuffy European sexologists. And it would be some time after that still before the term would be applied colloquially to this, the image of the creepy, bespectacled man up the road who likes to watch the schoolgirls at the bus stop while sipping tea on his porch. Now, having said all this, however, it would be a mistake to think that the gradual semantic migration of perverts didn't occur without the clattering bones of medieval morality dragging behind. Notice the suffix vert, generally to turn. Hence, convert means to turn to another. Revert means to turn to a previous state. Invert means to turn inside out. And pervert means to turn away from the right course. But pervert alone has that sort of devilishly malicious core to it. It's got this distinctive quality of obstinacy, notes one psychoanalyst, petulance, peevishness, self-willed in a way that distinguishes it from more common deviations. We still hear occasionally this term pervert or perverting being used in tune with its more archaic origins. Judges and lawyers might, for example, speak of perverting the course of justice, which is to say thwarting social fairness. In everyday parlance, however, this term is now reserved mainly for sexual deviants, or else used jokingly, and in some cases even claimed proudly, I think, for that sole purpose. Clearly, however, the word itself still possesses more than a little air from its moralizing past. So how did this sudden etymological transformation from religious heretic in 524 AD to disgusting sexual deviant only in the past century or so come to pass? Word meanings are so ingrained in our shared vernacular, and they're so communal in abstraction, that we often fail to appreciate that they are rooted not in divine decree, but in a solitary forebrain. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, Shakespeare reminds us. Likewise, a pervert by any other name would smell as foul, or at least make us bristle. Now, the first buds leading to the present-day pervert's horns is probably connected to the work of this person, the Victorian-era scholar Havelock Ellis from South London. He's often credited with being the first to use the word pervert in the sense of sexual deviant in the 1890s. Now, oddly enough, Ellis wasn't using the word pervert in a pejorative sense, quite the opposite, in fact, since he was actually among the very first to take a non-judgmental approach to understanding the natural variety of human sexual expression. He was also a vehement supporter of eugenics, and he even held court for a while as the president of the Galton Institute, an organization that sought to improve the fitness of the human race's genetic stock through carefully regimented breeding. The heritability of kinkiness didn't seem to worry him, however. In fact, it would be an affront to the very idea of irony to overlook how the scientist who first innocently referred to sexual deviants as perverts had his own unusual predilections. Ellis's urophilia, which is a paraphilia involving a primary erotic attraction to urine, has been well documented. I was completely normal, he wrote of his own sexuality in an otherwise lackluster autobiography. But oh yes, he said, before I forget, he reflects on his fondness for urine. And then kind of defensively, it's not extremely uncommon, and it has been noted of men of high intellectual distinction. In his senior years, this divine stream, as he called it, proved the cure for Ellis's long-standing impotence. He gave into these wet desires, and he even began to fancy himself quite openly a connoisseur of pisuses. He wrote, "I may be regarded as a pioneer in the recognition of the beauty of the natural act in women when carried out in the erect attitude." In one letter to a female acquaintance, he chided her for forgetting her purse at his house, adding this quotation, "I've no objection to your leaving liquid gold behind." Now, you laugh, but Ellis steadfastly refused to regard his urophilia as shameful. "It was never to me vulgar," he wrote, "but rather an ideal interest, a part of the yet unrecognized loveliness of the world." Yet where Ellis really made his mark, so to speak, was his landmark treatise on homosexuality. And this is where the term pervert first appears in the pages of his classic 1897 text, Sexual Inversion, one of the first psychosexual investigations into the nature of same-sex desires. In this book, co-authored by the erudite and actually gay literary critic John Addington Symonds, the authors used the term pervert interchangeably with the more neutral term invert. Inversion, in their view, reflected homosexuality as being a sort of flipped-around form of the standard heterosexual pattern of attraction, which was a clear enough use of that term. So the authors adopted perversion as a related but wider term, applying it to a range of socially prohibited sexual behaviors. In their turn-of-the-century view, which is actually quite progressive at that point, inverts, or homosexuals, were fairly normal as far as expected variance over the course of human history and within the natural world actually goes. So the semantic seams of the word perversion thread back to its original religious usage in Ellis and Symonds' understanding that homosexuals were just one of many different kinds of sexual minorities seen as sinful by that era's equivalent of the moral majority. Homosexuals were first labeled as perverts to reflect a questionable moral subjectivity, not to capture some deeper truth about their desires being wrong. Now, these authors were among a handful of pioneering sexologists that were finally beginning to carefully tease apart the complicated strands of human sexuality. Or at least they were using as rigorously objective an approach as could be mustered given the negligible amount of knowledge that was available to them at the time. Other scholars, such as the Austrian psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing, regarded by many as the father of abnormal sexuality studies, as well as the German psychiatrist Wilhelm Steckel, who coined the term paraphilia, were similarly committed to this newly objective, amoral, scientific approach to deviance. Their writings may seem tainted with bias to us today, and of course, they really are, but they also display a humanitarian concern for those who found themselves, through no doing or choice of their own, aroused in ways that society demonized them for. And it's worth bearing in mind, for instance, that, Sexual Inversion was penned on the heels of Oscar Wilde's sensationalized 1895 trial, in which this great Dubliner wit, of course, famously lamented the love that dare not speak its name. The world mocks at it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it, reflected Wilde before a London jury sentenced him to 2 years of hard labor for the crime of sodomy, as it was at the time. But these early sexologists also found themselves confronted by angry social purists who feared that such novel scientific endeavors would simply open the door for this inevitable collapse of morality. Such anxieties over the slippery slope effect have actually been around for a very long time. More socially conservative scholars saw these researchers' scientifically neutral approach to sexual deviance as a dangerous stirring of the pot, legitimizing wicked things as natural, variants of behavior, seducing normal people into the unethical lifestyles of the degenerate. Merely giving horrific conditions such as homosexuality their own proper scientific names, many of these early critics felt, made them that much more real and that much more threatening. Now, the distinction between homosexual behavior and homosexual orientation was actually groundbreaking, and it was what was arguably the first and most important step, I think, in the history of gay rights. It's also one of, I think, that's gone almost entirely unrecognized by most contemporary gays and lesbians. The early sexologists regarded homosexuality as a clear psychosexual trait or orientation, not just something one did with members of the same sex. This may seem like common sense to us today, but it was vital. Although most of the early sexologists, with perhaps the exception of Ellis, still considered homoerotic attraction to be a mental illness that wasn't to be indulged in, of course, their distinction between same-sex behavior and homosexuality as an orientation was a watershed moment. For the first time in modern history, inverts that acted on their same-sex desires were treated not as fallen people who were so licentious that they even resort to that, but as being true to their biological natures, flawed as these natures were then believed to be. It would take many decades for homosexuality to be decriminalized throughout the United States, Europe, and Australia as well, nearly a century before it was declassified formally as a mental illness. But this new medicalization of inversion was, at least by contrast with an earlier state of affairs, progressive in that it offered some degree of protection against overzealous prosecutors who sought to jail anyone who was caught in a same-sex tryst. Yet, the die had been cast for this disparaging term pervert and its accidental association with gays and lesbians. This connection actually lived quite long, even in the clinical literature. This was especially true within psychoanalytic circles, neo-Freudian circles in particular. Not so long ago, some scholars were still interpreting anal intercourse among gay men as an unconscious desire among the recipient to nip off the other's penis with his tightened sphincter. Never consciously occurred to me as I was engaging in that behavior, actually. But who knows? In this way, which is so characteristic of the pervert, argued the psychiatrist Mervyn Glasser in 1986, not terribly long ago, he is trying to establish his father as an internal object with whom to identify, as an inner ally and bulwark against his powerful mother. Now, that may sound as scientific to us today as astrology or etchings on a tarot card, but all the same, it's the type of thing that so many gay men would have expected to hear if they ever sought counseling for their inevitable woes in a world that saw them as mentally ill. Today, the word pervert sounds just silly, or at least provincial, when it's used to refer to gays and lesbians. Even such minor accomplishments, however, are the result of hard-won civil rights battles. And campaigning for full equality is still critically important for most same-sex couples. But the term pervert is still used freely and without any consideration, really, in the disparaging of other human beings who similarly have no say whatsoever over their sexual desires. It's as though, despite our humane and increasing appeals to science and the natural world in defending gays and lesbians, deep down we still suffer from the illusion that there's some sort of God who set the limits on the acceptable forms of sexuality, and from which all actual perverts deliberately and arrogantly stray. Even evolutionary biologists tend to frame their gay-friendly arguments on the sole fact that same-sex behaviors occur in other species too, which is seemingly to say, oh, relax, these people are fine because, they really aren't that weird in the grand scheme of things. There's good emotional currency in animal comparisons, and I like this tack very much for its rhetorical value. But it's also deeply problematic from a philosophical perspective because it simultaneously invokes a moral judgment against those people whose sexual orientations are not found in other species. When thinking about sex and morality, it's all too easy to fall prey to this philosophical error called the naturalistic fallacy, which I would imagine some of you have heard of. In effect, the fallacy assumes that that which is natural is therefore okay, good, or socially acceptable. But nature is two things and two things only. It's mechanistic and it's amoral. So, for example, heterosexual sex can produce offspring. Homosexual intercourse cannot produce offspring. Yet to extrapolate from these mechanistic facts of procreation some moral directive about what we should and should not do with our genitalia is to assume an intelligent creator that designed our reproductive anatomies. And that pre-Darwinian view, that there is some intelligent mind needed to account for the human form, and that this preconceived design should in turn somehow dictate our social behaviors, lies at the flawed heart of the unnaturalness argument against homosexuality. This is usually manifested in some god-awful rendition of the Adam and Steve fundamentalist refrain. But it also applies to the other paraphilias just as well, which, well, lest we forget, homosexuality was also considered to be for a very long time. Now, treating another person as being immoral in essence, simply because their brains and their genitals respond to non-traditional stimuli in a way that places them in the minority of the population, is really quite strange when you stop to think about it. And this is true no matter what form of sexual deviance we're referring to. Pedophiles are, of course, today's most wicked moral monsters. Yet, even in the case of pedophilia, behaviors and desires are often conflated as equivalent social tragedies. Sexual actions upon children or other vulnerable classes, such as the elderly or animals, may be harmful, and tremendously so, in fact, but it's clear that our moral judgments are not reserved to actions alone. Pedophiles are shunned whether or not they ever molest a child because they are essentialized as evil. They're disgusting and wrong. They're true perverts, in other words, in line with the term's original religious origins. Likewise, knowing that your neighbor can obtain sexual gratification only by masturbating to violent rape fantasies, or being aware that horses titillate your local liberal MP, would also probably cast them in a permanently unflattering light to you. Even though these people have not, to the best of your knowledge, ever harmed any child, any woman, any animal, it's all but impossible not to attribute to their ethereal sexual desires a significant moral weight. So how can sexually deviant thought, mere breath on the air, as the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once called the human mind, possess such a palpable presence? In fact, there's a revealing contradiction here, I think. On the one hand, society tends to believe that pedophiles, for instance, have actively chosen evil. What's next, we hear social conservatives say in response to many gay rights issues, the right to be a pedophile or to be a zoophile. But to be a pedophile, or a zoophile, or a teratophile, or an autoplushophile, or a whateverophile, has really never been illegal. Because what these people have in common is the nature of their sexual desires, not actions arising from these desires. Just as a homosexual who has never had sex, or has only been with the opposite sex, is still a homosexual, a pedophile who has never molested a child is still a pedophile. A zoophile who has never been with a non-human animal is still a zoophile, and so on. So to say that one doesn't have the right to be of these particular derogated classes is rather nonsensical, or at least it's fairly dark ages in its insinuation. It's equivalent to saying that a person does not have the right to exist, not because they've committed some terrible crime against another, but instead because they are rotten at their biological core. Yet note that if one accepts the view that nature is amoral, there can simply be no such thing as a rotten biological core. Still, many people today would no doubt endorse a preemptive extermination of social classes such as pedophiles, arguing that such measures are harsh but ultimately worth it since they protect children. We tend to have short memories for past actions of hasty extremism, however. And for many Americans, at least, navel-gazing at a similar better safe than sorry approach to sexual deviance in 17th century New England is a useful exercise. Now, the moral monsters of those days, 17th century American New England, were not pedophiles, but instead these were men who were in league with the devil to impregnate barnyard animals so that evil prodigies would quickly overrun this fledgling nation of theirs. This was a concept, prodigy, that was originated by this stridently prude medieval scholar Thomas Aquinas. That's not him, actually. That's a different picture. There we go. Thomas Aquinas, who coined the term prodigy to refer to those hybrid creatures sprung from the loins of another species but born of human seed. They could also be conceived through having sex with atheists, according to Aquinas. But it seems there were far fewer of those milling about the colonies than solicitous swine. Now, it's unclear if any of the early Americans that I'm about to tell you about were certifiable zoophiles, who are individuals genuinely attracted more to animals than they are other human beings. They may have used animals as surrogates for human partners and obtaining sexual gratification, or more likely they were falsely accused of such acts altogether. But researchers today at least know that zoophilia is a genuine paraphilia. Just as it's impossible for non-zoophiles, I would imagine maybe not necessarily, but the majority of this audience, to, say, become passionately aroused by the steaming mottled member of a Clydesdale, or by a panting German shepherd. Zoophiles cannot be easily aroused by other human beings. One such man, he emailed me, he emailed me. He was actually a highly intelligent physician from suburbia. He told me he could only consummate his marriage by closing his eyes and imagining his new bride as a horse. Needless to say, that marriage didn't last very long. Now, centuries ago, in the newfound colony of Plymouth, zoophilia was obviously not a known sexual orientation. Again, the construct of orientation simply doesn't appear anywhere until the late 19th century or so. There were only sexual behaviors. But the hysteria over Satan's prodigal litters reached dramatic heights with the 1642 trial of a 16-year-old boy named Thomas Granger. This randy adolescent had been indicted for taking indecent liberties with what seems an entire stable of animals, including, quote, a mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. Now, I realize the turkey part is probably a bit distracting, and how one goes about having sex with a large clawed bird is perhaps better left to the imagination. But even more remarkable is the legal diligence and sobriety with which this case was prosecuted. There was little question in these righteous minds trying him that the boy should be dispatched to the flames for his egregious violations of natural law. But there was a lot of head-scratching on the bench over which sheep exactly he'd been defiling, and therefore which of them should be killed and which of them spared. We heard from Sam Harris the other night about some of these trials attributing blame and responsibility for animals accused of committing crimes. This was crucial to sort out in this case because if they executed the wrong sheep, they risked the unthinkable happening. A monstrously bleeding hoofed prodigy might drop undetected onto Plymouth. So naturally, there was a lineup of busily masticating victims that was staged for Granger. With one trembling finger, the boy pointed out those 5 naive, amber-eyed ruminants that had been targets of his secret woolly lust. Court records, if you look at them, indicate that the animals were then, quote, killed before his face, according to the law, Leviticus, and then he himself was executed. 16-year-old boy, remember. Similar to how we might seek to detect covert pedophiles today by some fallible laboratory techniques and measurements of arousal, moral arbiters of the past often relied on flimsy evidence to support their claims of suspected buggers, which was Old English slang for he who has sex with pigs, dogs, donkeys, and all and other sundry critters. In New Haven in 1646, for example, not far from the Yale campus, and just a few years after this Granger affair, a servant by the name of George Spencer, who was notorious for having, quote, a profane, lying, scoffing, and lewd spirit, was executed for making love to his master's pig. He swore that he didn't do it, but unfortunately for Spencer, the sow happened to give birth to a deformed fetus, a prodigious monster, it was written, that resembled George a bit too closely for most people's comfort. The pig fetus had, this is written in the records, but one eye for use, the other hath, as it is called, a pearl, and it is whitish and deformed. And this embryological mishap was actually George's death sentence. His own ocular deformity bore an uncanny resemblance to that of the stillborn pig, and this was the critical piece of evidence that was held against him. Now, if anyone could commiserate with George Spencer and his troubles, it was a fellow citizen with the ridiculously unfortunate name of Thomas Hogg. Like Spencer, Hogg found himself at the center of an intense buggery investigation when a neighborhood sow bore another deformed fetus with, quote, a fair and white skin and head, as Thomas Hogg is. And as an aside, perhaps, it's hard not to help but pity the women of old New Haven, with so many of its male residents being reminiscent of aborted pig fetuses. But back to Thomas Hogg and his hogs. The allegations made against the former by the townsfolk were so serious, in fact, that the governor and the deputy governor personally frog-marched him out to the barnyard toward the sow in question and ordered him to scrat or to fondle the animal before their eyes. This was done to gauge just how intimately familiar they might be. And the records say, immediately there appeared a working of lust in the sow, insomuch that she poured out seed before them. When Hogg reluctantly titillated the teats of a different sow, that animal didn't return his affections. So he, like Thomas Granger and George Spencer before him, was executed. Now, these zero-tolerance laws against bestiality had been imported from Christian Europe, the stomping grounds of zealots like Aquinas. But an interesting development emerged on that side of the Atlantic in the 18th century that was highlighted by the case of a ragged French peasant named Jacques Ferron, who was tried for having sex with a female donkey. As described by Edward Payson Evans in a classic book called The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, Ferron would clearly be killed since he was, quote, taken in the act of coition with the animal. He'd be shoved along in shackles to the public square where an already smoldering steak was waiting to consume him in flames as he pleaded for mercy in front of a sea of scornful faces. Curiously, though, the locals chose not to slay the Jenny along with him. She was so beloved by the community that she was given her own separate trial, with witnesses to testify that not once had they ever seen her exhibit even the slightest sign of promiscuity. Before her proceedings, a certificate was drawn up affirming her virtuous reputation, and this impassioned plea was signed by the parish priest and was enough to persuade the court officials to acquit the animal on the grounds that she'd been raped. Now, if you think about it, the donkey case may sound absurd, but it was also a small moment in history in which people stopped and questioned religious ideas of punishment and chose their own more humane, rational course instead. Since God clearly prescribes death to any creature, willing or unwilling, tainted by human semen, the sparing of this she-ass might be seen as a graduation of sorts to the all-important principle of sexual consent, which is the defining feature of our own modern justice system. Now, fortunately, perhaps as the result of getting a little basic biology under our belts, and along with that knowledge, a cure for the trembling over Aquinas' ridiculous prodigies, Americans and Europeans alike eventually abandoned this practice of immolating those who were suspected of interspecies sex. And, since we now know that many Europeans possess Neanderthal DNA, it's quite tempting to speculate on how many of those fueling the bestiality fires of yore were actually flesh and blood prodigies themselves. Yet in many ways, we're still, I think, grappling with this all-important consent issue. Now, in terms of human-animal sex, bestiality is expressly illegal in the majority of U.S. states today, and in most developed countries around the world. In many places where bestiality is not listed formally as a codified crime, those who engage in sexual activities with animals are still occasionally prosecuted under animal cruelty laws. This is good and just overall, and I say this as a platonic animal lover myself. But some zoophilic cases are quite clearly in the gray zone, I think. So which is worse, as a hypothetical here? A stud manager, somebody who works in a horse facility that forcefully collects the semen of a prized racehorse by manually masturbating the stallion for her own commercial gain, or a woman who masturbates her companion horse in her own private stable to bring pleasure to both she and the animal. For zoophiles that prefer to be the recipients of anal penetration, in fact, this happens to be the majority of zoophiles, rather than those who do the actual penetrating of another species' orifices themselves, it's also rather odd to argue that the creature has not consented to its own act of insertion. And when penetration of other animals does occur, harm is still occasionally unclear. With equines, at least, anyone who has ever seen a horse penis approximately the size of a small motorcycle knows that it's probably unlikely that even the largest human phallus would cause anything approaching harm. Finally, while the thought of bestiality elicits significant moral outrage, most people in our society, strangely enough, have no such concern for the equally thorny problem of how to gain an animal's consent for eating it. Now, even when sexual consent can be linguistically gauged with members of our own species, it's not always so straightforward. In most cultures, for example, prevailing social forces determine the age at which people can legally participate in sexual activity with others, or at least others who are more than a certain number of years older than they are. Any given legal age of consent may sound to members of that society perfectly reasonable, and they might even be based themselves on some principle of human development. But that there are wild fluctuations in what constitutes a minor over both space and time also reveals whatever age selected to be an arbitrary set point. Until close to the 20th century, in fact, Delaware's legal age of consent was a mind-boggling 7 years old. And in most other states, it was around 12. Still, like anti-bestiality laws, such age restrictions on sexuality, whatever they are good and just overall, in that they are designed to keep children safe and adolescents from being harmed by sexually exploitative adults. More interesting to me than the cultural arbitrariness of particular age restrictions on sex is the philosophical problem. The very notion of a legal age of consent is like saying that a person cannot legally feel as he or she does. Throughout much of the world, any person under the age of 18 who agrees to some sexual action, or who even pursues this action of their own volition, is vetoed by a government that renders their psychology irrelevant in any consideration of harm posed to them as individuals. And unlike the case of the man who raped the donkey in 18th century France, consent in most criminal cases today involving adults accused of having sex with underage partners does not refer to the latter's mental state of willingness. Instead, the sexual feelings of anyone under the legal age of consent are held as the property of the state in which the minor subsides. So to have sex with a consenting minor, which is an oxymoron in legalistic terms, is to steal from the state. People do not inherit full rights to their own body, nor can they claim their private erotic desires as their own until some executively mandated calendar day. And only on that day does consent transform abruptly, and literally at the stroke of midnight, from a chronological state into a mental state, with the state relinquishing its power over the individual's genitals. There are many other examples of conceptual tensions in our thinking about the legal issue of consent. One would probably be stigmatized for doing so, for example, but it's perfectly lawful to have sexual intercourse with someone who is over the age of 18, but who has the mind of a child. The average mental age of a person with Down syndrome, for example, is that of an 8-year-old. Yet, unlike horny high school seniors brandishing average or even genius-level IQs, Down syndrome adults can legally consent to sex. Now, this is not to say that anomalous cases render broader protective laws illogical, but sometimes even our most passionate intuitions of wrongfulness aren't always as logical as we'd like to believe. Years ago, the psychologist Jonathan Haidt coined the term moral dumbfounding to refer to the phenomenon in which people struggle to elaborate on the precise reasons for why they believe some acts are immoral. Tautologies such as, it's disgusting because it's gross, or it's wrong because it's evil. These echo intense social disapproval for certain crimes that, emotions aside, arguably shouldn't be considered crimes at all. Now, consider this consent that I'm about to read, this vignette that I'm about to read to you. It's from a published study in this area. And here's what participants who were in this study heard. This was one of the examples of the stories that they read, and they were asked questions about it. A man belongs to a necrophilia club. And this necrophilia club has devised a way to satisfy the desire to have sex with dead people. Each member donates his or her body to the club after death so that the other members can have sex with the corpse. And the man has sex with a dead woman who gave her body to the club. So think about that for a little bit. When asked whether or not it was wrong for this man to do what he did, and more importantly, to articulate and to justify their responses, many participants defaulted to a presumption of harm in their moral reasoning. Even then, when they were told explicitly that the woman did not have any family members who might get upset if they found out what happened to her corpse, that the club isn't interested in recruiting or harming living people, that neither the man nor any of the other club members suffer any regrets or personal anguish about their sexuality, that the group's activities are kept private and consensual, that the man used protection to prevent the spread of disease, and per her instructions that the club cremated the woman's body after the man was done, most people still insisted that somehow or another, someone, somewhere, must be getting harmed. For social conservatives, the harm might even be seen as inflicted on symbolic entities. America, for example, the church, society, or even the sanctity of marriage. And it's not just necrophilic sex, of course. Researchers find presumption of harm reasoning among participants contemplating other verboten sex acts with similarly clear caveats about harmlessness, one of them including incest. So this is an image of the Peters twins, who are pornographic actors that happen to be identical twins. And it's very controversial that they actually engage in full anal penetration in their scenes. They are in love with each other. This is what they tell reporters and the media that actually engages in some type of discourse with them. I was never familiar with them before this. No, I'm just kidding. But I think it's a very interesting sort of hypothetical example here, because when we try to articulate why, we might have these sort of this intuition that it's wrong, or some aversive response to seeing identical twins like this actually engaging in intercourse. We have a difficult time, I think, unpacking why it's wrong exactly. There's no possibility of procreation in this sense, and genetic damages that are associated with their sexual activity. Now, that's all well and good, I think, for these abstract hypothetical examples, but for rape, child abuse, and bestiality, it's hard to see how such a powerfully negative response could ever be a bad thing, really. Even in evolutionary terms, moral outrage is a smart system, in that it helps to drive out malignant social elements that cripple the cohesive functioning of the group. Hatred of those who endanger the most cherished or vulnerable members of society is rational, if not always logical. The downside of having evolved to become so easily swept up by moral flash flooding in the sexuality domain is that these unyielding currents tend to drown out meaningful vicissitudes. Relatively harmless cases, harmless anyway when you accept that harm is something that can really only occur at the level of a subjectively experiencing organism, human or animal, that actually possesses pain receptors and neural systems that are able to register emotional trauma, not at the level of a mindless symbolic entity such as society. These harmless cases rattle in the emotional deluge against the most violent, unspeakable crimes. And as this colonial-era hunt for prodigies that we went over, and those suspected of conspiring with the devil to produce these hybrids showed, any social system that operates on a better safe than sorry principle is prone to moral panics and false positives. Whenever evil is perceived to be an essential trait, rather than reserved for harmful actions that are committed against actual others, human nature is going to become furtive, and people are going to cling to facades. So is it any wonder, then, that you blanched when I called you a pervert earlier on?
The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our lives. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships to continue our work. Donations can be made via the Festival of Dangerous Ideas website. Thank you.